Hello guys and welcome to the video. Today we're going to be looking at 10 tips to help you prepare your flight controller for the first time use. Let's get to it. Here is the flight controller that I will be doing the prep work on today. It's a Matek F405 and as you can see it comes in a anti-static bag. Tip number one is to protect the circuit by using an anti-static strap like this. So any static buildup in the body goes down to earth. Also, I would recommend cleaning the bench. So I use a little brush like this just to sweep off anything that's on the bench. For tip number two is all around visual inspection. So we can now take it out of its anti-static bag. And these other bits and pieces are very useful, but we're not going to look at those today. So here we are. Here's the flight controller. And it's got components on both sides. So what I tend to use is something like this eye cup magnifier, and have a really close inspection of the circuit board on both sides to make sure that no components have been knocked off, and it's really good idea to do that. Tip number three involves something that I call soak testing, which basically means that we're going to power on the circuit and leave it on for a prolonged period of time, like many hours. And to do that, we can very simply use a power supply like this. This is a USB power supply, and on the other end it has the micro USB. So we're basically going to connect it up like this and leave it running for a period of time. Here we have the flight controller powered up, and as you can see we've got a couple of LEDs lit, so that's a good sign. So what I'm going to do now is just leave it to one side on the bench there for about 24 hours. And I think it's a good idea to do this because a lot of complicated circuits nowadays, they can fail within the first couple of days. So it's good that we can actually detect that early on before we start using the flight controller. I would actually resist the temptation to solder things up on this right now and start using it, because if it was to fail and you've already soldered it, then chances are the supplier won't accept that back. But in this particular form like this, if it does actually die, then you've got a good leg to stand on in terms of warranty with the manufacturer. Tip number four is all around printing off the PCB and indicating on the pads here where they're going to go to on the other parts of your quadcopter. So it's good to do this while the flight controller is being soak tested. Having a piece of paper like this with all the wiring indicated on it is a really good reference that you can use when you actually come to do the wiring for real. So it's a really handy tip, I think. Here's a bonus tip for you. I do put the piece of paper on a stand like this, so I can mount it in the background like that, and then I can work on the quadcopter here. That's just my little preference. Tip number five is all around checking the functions of the circuit board or flight controller in this case. So what we're going to be doing is using the Betaflight configurator through the USB, checking some key functions here, and we'll also use our goggles with this particular flight controller, or a monitor if we have one. Here in the Betaflight configuration software, in the setup menu, we can see that as I move the flight controller in different directions, that the model on the screen is moving too. So that's a good indicator that the gyro is working fine. It's also good at this point to check other systems, like if we go to the sensors menu, we can have a look at the readouts from the various sensors. So we've already seen the gyro working, but there's a trace there that shows the gyro working. Also the accelerometer too, you can see that in the middle, that's also working well. And on this particular board it has a barometer, so it measures altitude. So if I put the flight controller near the floor, you can see that bottom blue graph is quite low, and then if I raise it above my head, you can see it's just starting to rise there. So that's a good indicator that those and the sensors on board the flight controller are working fine. For the next function test, I'm just going to have a look and see if it's reading the SD card. So this one has an SD card underneath the board, and here we can see that it does read that card, and I've already got some information on that card, so that's also a good thing. This next check is to confirm that the OSD is working. So this one is in two parts. The first part is to see that the menu is working, which it is. And then the second part is more of a physical test. And what that involves is having your goggles or a TV monitor, and with the cable coming out of the goggles here, we can connect up to the flight controller. I have a little adapter here, and then with these little pin headers I can connect it into the board and make sure that I'm getting a video signal through the goggles or monitor. So I'll do that off camera. Obviously I'm going to do it with it powered off, and then I'll show you the results. So here's the flight controller with the pin headers connected to ground and also the VTX connection. And it's not soldered, it's just applying a little bit of pressure to the holes on the PCB, and then I can actually now see on the goggles that the OSD is working fine, so that's a really good sign. Tip number 6 is making sure that we can recall what the target is, the Betaflight target for this particular board. Now we can see up here that we've got this code MKF4, and also down in this area we can see MKF4, which is fine. However, to get the real truth, you need to go to the CLI and type in version, and then that will tell you that the true name is Matek F405. So when you come to do your flashing, so if we disconnect here, come into firmware flasher, and there we can see is what we need to be choosing, this Matek 405. So that's a little handy hint there. For tip number 7, we're going to make a copy of the configuration that has been loaded already on this board when it was shipped. So I tend to go into the CLI and do dump all, and then select all of that configuration data and save it as a text file for later reference, because you never know, you might need to call upon those pieces of information when you come to do your reflashing of the firmware. Tip number 8 is when we're starting to think about soldering the wires onto the circuit board. And yes, this has holes through the headers on the board there, and we can put the wire through and solder it from the back end. But what I like to do is use these little pins here, these pin headers here, and we would then just solder those through the holes like that, solder them from the back side, and then that gives us a very firm base for us to solder the wires on like that. And just before we do solder those headers, we would use a flux pen like this, which would make the joints much easier to solder to. And because we have our diagram here, we know exactly how many of these we need to cut out and the positions of them. So I'm going to go ahead and solder those on out of frame, and then we'll come back. Hello, it's Tony from the future here. It's worth noting that everything we've looked at so far has been non-destructive, so there's been no changes to any components or anything of the flight controller here, no soldering, no nothing. So that means that if we'd had found something wrong during our testing, then we would have been in a good position to contact the manufacturer or the distributor of this flight controller in an attempt to lodge a warranty claim and maybe get a refund or a replacement board, because there's been no changes to it. So let's continue. Here we have the board with the pins all soldered on now. So there's a couple of things we need to do before we move on, and that is to use a nice sharp pair of pliers, and I'm going to cut these off round about to this length here. We don't need to have them too long. And the second thing is to use alcohol and a nice clean toothbrush and clean all the old flux off the board. Here's our flight controller, now all nice and clean. There's no flux on any of those joints. So now we move on to tip number 9, which is to conformal coat the circuit board on both sides. So that's using this silicone based coating here, which we use this brush and coat it really thoroughly all over both sides of the board. Now on this particular one we do have a barometer, so I need to be careful not to seal that up. And yeah, so let's get to that. Here we have the board with 2 coats of conformal coating, and you can see it's quite shiny and very well protected from the elements. And that leads us on to the 10th and final tip. And this is how I would connect the wires up to the pins on the flight controller. So I would solder them up in the normal way like this. However, I'd use a piece of thin heat shrink and place that over the top and then heat that up. So it just gives a little bit of extra binding, a little bit of extra protection in case anything went wrong. But really, you know, this is not going to shake loose. It's really quite a good connection. If at some point I did need to take the cable off, then I just cut that bit of heat shrink there with a knife or a pair of side cutters. So there we have it. 10 tips on how to prepare your flight controller before you start using it on your mini quad. Now, of course, these are just my tips, my opinions on what I do personally. And the reason why I do go to such great lengths is because I do tend to fly long distance and fly over water. And so it's absolutely critical for me not to lose my aircraft. The investment in time and money in the aircraft, I don't want to lose that. So that's why I go to such great lengths. If you have any comments or questions, then please let me know. Many thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.